So, good morning. Yesterday we passed the first day with the new government, trying to show that what has been happening in the past was not enough and that we have more competent staff to do better. The day yesterday finished off with the finding that based on the first analysis of the facts and data, that there is no evidence, no fact base for the current precautions. From my point of view, this is a lot of work. That's why I rolled up my sleeve and put off my suit. So I have the competency to set the guidelines, but the individual resorts have to give their contributions. But we would like to start by reporting to the federal president, who is going to give us his statement. Professor Ruppert.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. I would like to make a statement. Dear citizens, sorry we made you wait for nearly an hour now. Dear citizens, the constitution of the interim government on the 20th of August 2021 has determined that there is no emergency justifying emergency measures. This is why the measures instituted by the previous government are obsolete. The modifications to the Infection Protection Act for the combating COVID-SARS-2 must be revoked. Unfortunately, we fear that the measures are causing more damage than good. For instance, we need to analyze which damage the genetic manipulation referred to as vaccinations cause in people, in particular in children, and how we can counteract this damage. An important lesson that we should take from this supposed pandemic is a better understanding of health and disease. Disease is not caused in a monocausal way by individual factors. They are the result of a complex interplay of psychological and physical and material causes. This is why different specialities have to be referred to protect our population. Virology with mathematical models alone is not a sufficient specialty to derive appropriate measures for our population, for the protection of our population. It is also important to see whether we have an infantile approach to death, which we perceive as a great disaster, or whether we have a self-determined life as adults. The government cannot stop anyone from living a self-determined and healthy life. It can only take measures that allow people to live healthily. It can also make sure that the population does not fall victim to unscrupulous profiteers. It can also ensure that the health system does not fall victim to a profit-oriented system. We have to find that these things, unfortunately, keep repeating themselves. There are artificial problems where individuals promise solutions that only they can deliver. These people then assume the role of saviors of the public. They don't want to be perceived as the exploiters who they are, but as benefactors. We see this in throughout human history. In the name of peace, preparations are made for war. The sufferers are always the bulk of the population who are regularly cheated into false assumptions. This is reflected in the current situation unfolding in Afghanistan. We see similar terminology being used in the context of Corona. We're at war that we need to fight, but what we're really dealing with is a pathogen that needs to be fought. Behind wars, there's always hidden agendas. It's always the interest in accumulating money. What's behind this? It's the fears of people. Fears are always based on the fear of violence. They're also the source of hatred and destruction. Adolf Hitler, for instance, was a person dominated by fear. Any person who has this kind of agenda harbors his own disaster. Our human fears are often based on rejection and unrequited love. They cannot be healed through fear. So we can learn one thing above all others. It's the root of all evil is our fears. If we wish to build a better future for our society, we must not reinforce existing fears, terrorizing each other, causing additional psychological pain to each other. Everybody can double-check this in their own lives, their private lives. Do I act on the basis of my fear or on the basis of love? So if we approach the crisis with the common good in mind, we will be able to solve this, to overcome this crisis. I wish the interim government all the best of luck today in order to find additional clarity for us on the basis of their efforts to pursue the common good.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I think these are the right words to introduce us to our topic of today. The crucial question will we be guided by fear? That means, will we be confused, that we cannot have clear thoughts anymore to check what is going on? And that is not only us and the experts, but it's everyone, and draw our own conclusions. Or can we come back? Can we come back to what used to be called common sense and what is only possible without fear? And this question is particularly important when we look at the vaccination, which is a topic we're going to look at today. That is the one action, although we said there is no basis for any of these actions, but this action is the one which is immediately and can be catastrophic for anybody if the concerns of the medical staff who we've heard come true. There's no basis for the masks either. There's no basis for the social distancing, but vaccination is a direct bodily impact, and we will have to check whether, as today, these could be done according to the Nuremberg Codex. And as they have no basis, at least they are not causing harm, because that's the only question that needs to be clarified. If I don't have a basis for vaccination, I can't vaccinate. So we hope that they are not hazardous, at least. But should they be hazardous, and it turned out that this is the case, and this is not vaccinations, this is something that has to be stopped immediately. According to my personal conviction, this must be done immediately, but we're going to call upon more experts to clarify this topic today. So I think it'd be good to start with the Minister of Health, who is close to this. Dr. Wodarg, what is going on with the vaccinations? Are these things vaccinations? Are they possibly harmless? Are they not effective? Or what is going on here?
Herr Gesundheitsminister.
Now I'm with you. Okay. To start with, hello everybody. Let me start with a short historic excursion going back to 2009. In the summer of that year, the German Parliament, just prior to the electoral campaign in Germany, took a decision that few people noticed. I have to admit that even as a member of Parliament at the time, who was involved very deeply in this topic, I hardly noticed what was happening there. I'm talking about the Medication Act, which was modified at the time. It defines what a vaccination is, and it says that a vaccination is the insertion of antigens to incentivize or stimulate the immune system to create antibodies, and it was modified to include the insertion of nucleic acids to be part of the definition of a vaccination. That was done because otherwise this would be clearly defined as a genetic intervention, a genetic modification, which doesn't necessarily mean that the genome is modified, which is passed on to the next generation, but also it may mean that messenger RNA or other nucleic acids are inserted that may change the function or the shape of a cell that it is inserted into. So this is a part of the definition of a vaccination since 2009, even though this technology hadn't been licensed by then, and even though we only now see this happening in humans for the first time now that it's being done experimentally. So for 10 years it had been dormant, but it had been inserted 10 years ago by interested circles, and it had been planned back then, except that nobody dared do it because the resistance against these genetic modifications in the population was very large. Let me just remind you of the fact that the Green Party were always at the forefront of rejecting the release of genetically modified organisms, for instance, in agriculture. And I used to fight alongside the Green Party when I was in Parliament to prevent this from happening. What happened now is very surprising, and it came because the argument was that this is a very extraordinary situation, so we need to take extraordinary measures. This mRNA technology and the use of vectors, i.e. the genetic modification of bacteria and viruses, so that they can be injected in people, and these viruses then infect people and go into the cells where this nucleic acid that was inserted into the viruses leads to the generation, to the production of these spike proteins. So we have two different types of modifications. We have the insertion of spike protein coding nucleic acids through nanoparticles, with a shell of lipid nanoparticles, ensuring that these nucleic acids are inserted into the cell. That's Moderna and Pfizer. And we have these viruses that don't make people sick, but they spread very well among people. So you use this virus, you insert this gene sequence, that genetic sequence that creates this spike in the cell, and that was now licensed as an emergency allowance in the EU, and that was something that came very surprisingly to me. And of course I observed that there had been attempts in veterinary medicine, and that it was tried there, and that they made an attempt to create vaccinations that will spread among animals. So in order to eradicate rabies, for instance, you could use these genetically modified viruses, and you can design them such that they do not kill the animal, but lead to the production of antibodies. They are attenuated viruses, they are rabies pathogens, so they can continue spreading. And that means that the animals would infect each other with rabies pathogens that no longer kill the animal, but generates the production of immune reactions in the animals that get infected. And that has been done for a number of years now. And that is done to make sure that their disease can no longer spread from animals to humans. That has been discussed for Ebola and other diseases coming from animals. This approach of modifying viruses is a novel approach, and we have to take a close look at what was ruled out in the licensing process. What was observed? Is it possible for these viruses to modify in the body again so that they can spread, including the information for the formation of spike proteins? That would be a self-propagating vaccination. How has it been ruled out that this can happen? Let me remind you that when the poliomyelitis vaccination was instituted, the swallow vaccination led to a situation where these viruses modified in the body of children such that they actually were capable of causing the disease again, so that they actually caused polio in children. So they can remodify and then spread again. So whether this can happen again with these viruses now, with these modified viruses we've now, that in passing through people, they can modify back to becoming pathogenic. That is something I don't know, but we will have to find out what the risk is, how high this risk is, and we will have to take that into consideration in dealing with these vaccinations and in handling the people, in dealing with the people who receive these vaccinations. So these are risks where we don't have the right information, and I'd like to point out that these experiments now, these attempts to introduce these vaccinations in humans for infection prevention were only started at the beginning of last year in the context of clinical studies, and these studies only involved a few tens of thousands of people. And there were studies that were performed and controlled where the data were hosted by the sponsors, i.e. by those who have an interest that this works out so that they can make business with these vaccinations. And we've seen again and again that the pharmaceutical industry suppresses data that they're not happy with. We've seen that with numerous medications, that there was selective publication going on, and that the results that were positive were published twice as frequently as the results that were not so positive. Only recently have there been attempts in science to ensure that everything is registered and published, but whether this is the case in this case, where a real lot of money is at stake, is something we cannot ascertain yet. So on the one side, we have these various risks with the vector vaccines and the vaccines with nanoparticles. We heard yesterday briefly that the nanoparticles and their distribution throughout the body leads to additional risks because the nanoparticles have been found to accumulate in the ovaries, and this can lead to inflammations because the nanoparticles house the mRNA, so that's the codes for the spike production. And if the spikes are produced, then this leads to a violent inflammation reaction, destroying the tissue, the surrounding tissue. And if that happens in the ovaries, that can lead to severe damage to the ovaries, resulting in infertility. So there are observations, anecdotal evidence, but no studies trying to determine this. And the interesting thing is that there was no animal testing to rule out that possibility. I think that it is a very high risk, and it requires a lot of effort to determine this, and we have to make the research funds available. We could take them from elsewhere, where we are looking into the sense or nonsense of masks, so that we can better evaluate the risk here. That requires international cooperation, but we might talk about that in our further discussions. That's as much as I have to say at this point.
The main criteria for something to be licensed as a vaccination seems to be that what is brought into the body should cause immunity. Is that correct to say so?
That's correct, yes.
So, if that what is achieved is not immunity, but in best case prevention of serious causes, can that be a vaccination?
Well, I only talked about the risks earlier. That's now the question of the benefit. And here we have to see that there are clear studies indicating that both the viral load and the infectiousness of people who have been vaccinated and those who haven't been vaccinated doesn't differ much. Those in positions of responsibility up until now has been the narrative that this is due to breakthroughs and the vaccine wasn't effective. We know these processes from the influenza vaccinations, and that's the argument here, because the viruses keep changing and the vaccines are developed on the basis of viruses that are disappearing, and that is used against viruses you're not familiar with yet. That's always the case with respiratory diseases, because they keep modifying, and that is true for all respiratory diseases and flus. And if you take a closer look of what we're doing now, that would mean that we would develop a immunity against viral surface structures that will change within short order. So we can rest assured, because our immunity, where the immune system is active in the mouth, throat and nose, is quite successful, and the viruses are well fended off. They are both corona and influenza viruses. But that means that these viruses, these vaccines now, just like the flu vaccines, are not injected as a nasal spray into the area where the immune system is active. Instead, they're injected somewhere in the body where they lead to an immune reaction where the body isn't even able to do this, where it is actually overtaxed with the viruses that suddenly appear somewhere in the muscle tissue or are otherwise inserted into the body. So here we have unnatural immune stimuli that sort of confuse, if I may put it this way, the communication between immune cells. Immune cells communicate with cytokines. They are substances that allow for communication between the immune cells. Then there are different types of cytokines. There's leukocytes that play a role here, and other tissue cells that play a role here. But these cells communicate in a way with each other that allows them to notice and that communicates to the cells that something is happening, that something needs to be done. Specialists need to be called in, just like the fire brigade or the police are being called in, just like in a city. You call different squads for a bank robbery than for others. So if the fire is out, then the fire brigade doesn't need to keep coming, but you have to and clog the road. But instead, you have to tell the fire brigade, okay, the fire is gone, and you need this sort of feedback. And this mechanism, this braking mechanism, is really important, because if that doesn't happen, you get a mad alarm, and the entire body is alarmed, and then this can lead to organ failure. That's the cytokine storm that you hear so much about. So it's a complete communication failure at cellular level. And the big risk here is that these interventions, of which we don't know where they happen, could cause this. Maybe the body may not immediately respond like that, but maybe when something similar happens, that this major conflagration starts then, and the fire brigade may then start to pour petrol on the fire instead of water. So that means that a lot of people may be at risk. And believe that this is something that could happen in the winter now, when we have the next respiratory spike anyway. Some immunologists believe that this may happen. Some say that it will definitely happen. I cannot really tell you what's true here. But what is certain is that as a government we have to prepare for something happen there. So we need a new preparedness, vaccination damage preparedness. We have to think about of how to deal with it if the worst case happens. And if we're lucky, then it's only a few people who have late damage or secondary damage. And if we're unlucky, it will be a large number of people. So we need the necessary options to help them. And we do need to do research here, and maybe we'll have to invest some money. We have to take the hospitals, the doctors on board. I have to hold a conference of the health ministers with the ministers of health of the individual states in order to determine what are we going to do, because the states are responsible for looking after public health. So we have to get the health ministries on board. The health officers have to be brought on board. They can't continue closing their eyes to this. They have to see this risk. And the other risk obviously doesn't play the role that has been claimed so far.
It's very important that we stated clearly here that we have no evidence-based risk from a so-called pandemic, because there's no basis for this. There's no evidence for the assumption that we have an epidemic of national concern, because there's no indication that there is an overwhelming situation for the health system. The crucial word here is immunity, and that plays a twofold role. On one hand, on the question, as Dr. Mike Yeadon told us, or John Ioannidis also said so, Peter McCall mentioned this, whether we are already into herd immunity against what is out there, which we know is not more dangerous than a normal flu. Nobody's saying that there is nothing there, but there seems to be herd immunity, and if this is the case, then of course there's no basis for the vaccination. This is one of the fact bases that we can say on that there is nothing that would justify the vaccination. But for me, it would be crucial, and we want to ask this question to the Minister of Justice later on, whether the criteria for this, of something being called a vaccination, is that the goal to achieve immunity, as it seems to be defined so far, that in relation to other treatments often apparently aim to avoid serious causes, while in vaccination aims to achieve immunity, to avoid consequences at all. Is that right?
Well, it's a bit more.
So.
Well, we can continue just to explain our problems. It seems that we are deliberately impeded in broadcasting this live stream, but the technicians will handle it.
Let me just say, it's a concept of the new government that we give a live streaming of our meetings here to be transparent, especially to the behavior of the old government, and this is why we decided to have everybody participate live in what we're doing.
We want transparency. We don't want things to be done in the back rooms.
Yes, and the technical equipment still needs to grow up to it.
Yes, but we'll keep improving this as we move into this role. Fellow Minister, back to the question of immunity. What does immunity mean? This is important in two ways. First of all, if we have herd immunity already against this virus, which is no more dangerous than a flu with a 0.04 or 0.05% mortality rate, what does it mean if we herd immunity? We don't need a vaccination anymore. And what is the characteristic of a vaccination? Isn't that it causes immunity, or is to cause immunity?
Well, I have had documentation which is all about immunity. It's a general term and it has a different meaning for legal people and politicians. The point is that a live organism can defend itself in its identity against anything that is in its surrounding, and that it knows what it is and it stays itself and it is not broken up. That's what we have the immune system for, and that is what is called immunity. So, and that is learned. This is phylogenetic. We are born with this. This is something that is working very well in mammals, and that is something that helps us and protects us for the first months and weeks of our lives. And we start learning. Our body starts learning with that part of the immune system that is ready with open sensors, but which hasn't seen the world yet. And this is what our immune system gets to know and learns how to deal with, to decide what is good and what's bad. Just think about the food that we eat. We don't want to defend the food. We need the food that we eat. So something strange comes into the body knows how to handle it. And if this is pathogens coming in, the body recognizes these are difficult, and it's very complex, a controlled process that aims to keep our bodily integration intact, to give us a long life. And if we talk about herd immunity, This usually relates to pathogens that we are in contact with. And we learn to recognize these as children. All the respiratory illnesses, we get these early in our life and learn how to deal with them, so that herd immunity is nothing constant. The herd learns all the time. And if the herd gets to know the pathogen of the past season, it won't know the one of the next. But as it is similar to the one that we've had before, it is only a little update that the body needs to do, and the immune system can well deal with this to see this is a pathogen and that needs to be defended off. And this is where we talk about herd immunity being a descriptive term, but that means that our immune system is always kept up to date, and that keeps us fit to deal with what we are confronted with. And what the vaccination does, or what it should do, is defined in the drugs law. Here it says vaccinations are drugs in the sense of paragraph 2, sentence 1, with antigens or recombined nucleic acids, that's what I said is new, and that are intended to create specific defendants in humans or animals, and in as far as they are recombining nucleic acids, are intended to prevent infections. So there's two vaccinations with and without acids, nucleic acids. There are some vaccinations that are not used against infectious diseases, if you follow the logics of what is said in the law here. But the nucleic acids, it said we only want to create protective substances against infectious diseases. It could also be possible to do that against cancer cells, where we know what the structures are. There could be vaccinations created against this. So vaccination against cancer could be a big business if it's developed, and that's being done. BioNTech is specialized on this. But these are not infectious diseases. So this is why this definition does not apply. So in that case, one would not be allowed to talk about vaccination, but that's what they do.
Well, and I believe that they're not talking of vaccination anymore. These are genetic therapies for the treatment of cancerous diseases, where you can take a high risk because the person who has cancer is already at a high risk. But this is about the creation of a defense mechanism, i.e. immunity against certain diseases. That's the only way it could be.
Yeah, and this is transferable diseases, illnesses. So this is transferable infections which may cause illnesses and diseases and so on. And these vaccinations, if they are applied, they compete with this. They are to add and maybe even make the internal defense in superfluous, and the definition was changed by the WHO now, saying that herd immunity can only be achieved by vaccination. And that would mean that everything the body can do, which is much stronger and much more perfect than any industrial product could be, this is pushed out and forgotten and replaced by new and maybe hazardous new technologies. Of course, they want to vaccinate us against everything and forget that we do not really need it.
I think we have to take a very close look at this. and see that this is for the second time in a crucial area, and in particular by the WHO. There has been a modification, should alarm us all. I am very alarmed by this. We learned that the first time the definition of pandemic was modified on the occasion of the swine flu 10 years ago. Before that, a pandemic was composed of three aspects: a global pandemic with grave consequences and numerous deaths. Suddenly it is changed. We don't need grave diseases and many diseases anymore. It only has to be a global disease. So basically, if I don't misunderstand it, any flu could be a pandemic, right?
Yes, even the term pandemic was only created in the 80s and established and then really brought about in the 90s, and in this millennium we started with the preparedness.
Anyway, this definition of the pandemic, even if it was only developed in the 1980s, as far as I remember and as far as I can see in discussions with normal citizens, everybody believes that it is a global disease with severe, grave consequences and many deaths. And suddenly it's only a global disease anymore, and that really makes me think a lot. We'll have to think about what the role we can give to this WHO organization anymore. And we have a second modification of a definition, the herd immunity. The herd immunity refers to an entire population. In the past, it was achieving 60% of the population is immune through cross-immunization, because the immune system remembers a previous disease, maybe a corona disease, recognizes the similarity to a new corona disease, and T-cell activity, because a lot of the population, large part of the population, has already been in contact with this new corona disease, and this together, cross-immunity and T-cells leads to herd immunity. Suddenly this is modified anyway, and this natural immunity is no longer accepted. Only the vaccination-born immunity is accepted, and that is something that I, as a non-physician, but as a layperson, perceive this as an absurd redefinition, again by the WHO, where I kind of wonder, how can they assume sovereignty over us in Germany and other countries in the world with this grotesque approach? So, yes, go ahead.
Immunity cannot be defined by law. That is nonsense. It's much too complex for that. Lots of things are thrown together here, and herd immunity, I know that as an official doctor, it was used to say that we called it a vaccination degree of 80% or at least above 50, depending on the disease. This was theories to sell these vaccinations. Even at the times, it was talked about the degree of vaccination of a population, and this term herd immunity took over gradually, and the herd is immune. It is right, the young lambs learn to pick up the pathogens, the agents, and some of them, we learn them once and they stay with us, like herpes is one of the major examples. Measles is something you don't get twice, but the respiratory illnesses are something different. These are contacts with certain viruses that use certain biological gaps, and which are completely different. And this is completely different than the standard measles vaccinations. And if herpes makes sense as a third thing. So it's very, very complex systems on how our bodies deal with microorganisms and coexist with them. And the question is of the benefit. Where can we see if it is a benefit or not? And this benefit cannot be seen in antibodies. It can only be seen in an epidemiologic survey to see whether people fall sick or not. And we had the definition for these things. These are at the SW at the moment, which the European body for virologists that joined up and which think about other viruses as well, where to develop new markets, because this body is funded by the big vaccination producers, and that is what we have. And they have regular meeting of Mr. Drosten. Mr. Drosten is there, and so on. Okay, you've just said that we are just looking on a single group of scientists. We can't rely on them. There has to be an overall view. We have to look at the psychologists, the economists, the physiologists. I need clear information here. So do we have, as Mike Eden said it, compared to looking at the virus, which is out there, which doesn't seem to be more dangerous than anything we know, do we have herd immunity?
Yes.
And okay, good. So against this background,
in excess of 90% of the residual activity.
Okay, that's a clear statement, and there is no more questions to this. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Justice, Dr. Holzeisen, in the context of your professional work as a lawyer, you had the 4 nullity file suits against the European Commission due to the licensing, the emergency licensing of the 4 vaccines. In that, you looked at that in more detail. What did these producers supplement in terms of documentation to the EMA, the European Drug Agency, and what is there the point? Dr. Holzeisen, are you with us?
Can you hear us now?
Yes, we can.
It's important to point out that the official documents of the European Medication Agency, which refers to the data submitted by the drug companies, it becomes clear that at the point of the restricted licensing, there was no indication of so-called sterile immunity, and thus the interruption of the infection chains by the use of these substances. As a legal expert, I only want to refer to the licensing documents and the documentation submitted by the producers themselves. I would like quote page 92 of the public assessment report of EMA concerning Pfizer-BioNTech licensing. Under item 4, they speak about the conclusions concerning the clinical efficacy of this substance. So the vaccine by Pfizer-BioNTech, which is referred to as a vaccine, just like the other substances, but de facto act like a genetically therapeutic product. This is why it was necessary that these conditional licensing, why was it possible to refer to that as vaccines? It was possible because years ago the European Commission took a decision which then became law in the EU on the basis of the European Commission. Simply what was done was, without any factual basis or justification, comment was inserted into the European Medication Act that for a vaccine, the very much more stringent requirements on a genetic therapy will not apply. So for the producer and the European Medication Agency can simply call the treatment a vaccine, which will immediately exempt the producer and EMA from the much more stringent studies required for genetic therapies, even though de facto they are genetic therapies. If we take a look at the definition of the genetic therapies, according to the European Medication Act, it is a perfect match with the conditionally licensed substance at hand, i.e. the insertion of a modifying nucleate designed to stimulate the production of the spike protein. That's exactly the definition, the European definition of a genetic therapy. So this modification inserted a few years ago and which stayed pretty much under the radar, now has this factual, unsubstantiated consequence that these substances are exempt from the genetic therapy requirements. Well, now, let me quote from page 97 of a public report on the Pfizer-BioNTech treatment, item 4, conclusions on clinical efficacy. It is likely that the vaccine also protects against severe COVID-19, although these events are not corroborated by the studies, and further conclusions cannot be drawn. It is unclear whether it has an impact on viral transmission. So EMA itself declares that currently there is absolutely no evidence what the impact is of applying this substance and what impact it is on the infection chain. Nor has it been shown that this substance can effectively prevent severe cases of COVID-19, because the study protocols showed very few such cases.
I have to say, I'm extremely concerned on how this was possible, that even in their own descriptions we have the declaration that there is no efficacy.
That is indeed the case, Vice Chancellor. It is actually shocking, because one of the crucial requirements, according to EU Directive 507 of 2006, is a balanced risk-benefit ratio. But if the benefit, according to judgment, i.e. the public assessment report, according to the public assessment report of the European Medical Agency itself, can only assume an efficacy, but not statistically proven, because the study protocols did not provide a statistical basis for this, for the statement that it is efficacious against COVID-19. We have to conclude that it is obvious that these substances were not licensed for combating COVID-19 because EMA itself says that they have no idea whether or not it's efficient. As EU legislation, i.e. Directive 507 of 2006, requires, even for a conditional license, that the benefit must be shown. And where EMA declares itself, we're actually quite unsure concerning the interruption of the infectious chain, then it is quite clear that this conditional license can only be made for an assumed of grave cases of COVID-19. And if we look at the information sheets, that Schedule 1 concerning the 4 decisions made by the EU Commission on the basis of the positive finding of the European Medical Agency, granting the conditional license for a year, and these schedules can be looked on the website of the Human Register. They are updated with the cases, new cases of grave side effects, and that's the next legal topic of the risk involved, and which is part of the determination of the risk-benefit ratio. And again, the supposed positive benefit ratio, risk-benefit ratio has to be called into question. So one thing is clear, the licensing documents themselves clearly state that these are substances that were not licensed for the interruption of the infection chains because there is no evidence for its efficacy in that way. And as a justice minister, it is quite clear to me on this basis that there must be no obligation to get vaccinated directly or indirectly, a direct or indirect obligation, because as soon as there is no evidence that the vaccine effectively interrupts the infection chains, we cannot speak about solidarity being in play here. Any moral pressure, as we've had it since December of last year, and which has been accumulated since then, and we can see that in other EU countries, and I'm referring to our neighbors in France and Italy, where such obligations to receive a vaccination, at least for individual groups of people, for medical personnel, in other words, but where we're looking at a rollout for the entire population. When we have genetic therapies here that The documents show that they're ineffective, and you can actually look this up on the public record of 𝗔𝗍. You only have to look at public records, COVID, then the internet will show you these documents. You can do that for the other 3 substances as well. And Chancellor, it's also important to take a look at the reporting mechanism of the producers, which has also been published for all those 4 substances. And this risk management plan, which of course will not exaggerate the risk, because it comes from the manufacturers themselves. Under the chapter Missing Information, important facts are shown. For instance, that the mid and long-term effects of these substances are unclear, that nothing is known about the impact on pregnancies or breastfeeding mothers. So if you see that, the manufacturers themselves declare that data is missing concerning any trigger of autoimmune diseases. And of course, the health minister will know more about this than I do, but as a layperson, as a potential patient, and as it is an autoimmune disease that affects a lot of people, rheumatoid arthritis alone is one potential complication triggered by this medication. So it cannot be ruled out that people with rheumatism might have complications here.
Let me just jump in here. We're just working on the technical issues. I'll take the opportunity to summarize what you've just said. We have to conclude, at least I do so, that the 𝗔𝗺 themselves, based on the provided documentation by the manufacturers, they can't say whether it is effective and whether it has side effects or not. Maybe it may, that's the hope, be effective against severe courses. That's right, okay. And that corresponds to the contracts that we have here at the moment between the individual states and BioNTech Pfizer. I expect the others' contracts to include the same contracts, and these contracts explicitly say that the producer is not liable for anything, and they are freed from any liabilities by the patients, and they are protected against this liability by the national governments. And that means the taxpayers will pay for the damages, and there can't be any statement whether the substance is effective or whether it is hazardous. So these contracts which have been kept closed so far, they have been disclosed by whistleblowers. That seems to correlate with the documentation presented to the 𝗔𝗺. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. These are advance purchase agreements that have been leaked and which are therefore available to us, and they are basically matches. So the agreements made by the European Commission on behalf of the member states, they are perfect matches. So we are aware of the first agreements that were made with Pfizer, with Moderna, I'm sorry. So additional agreements have become available, made between these manufacturers and third countries. For instance, the agreements with Brazil and Albania, which we have put our hands on so far as well.
Before we go into details here, let's just fix the sound. We need a couple of minutes, the technicians have told us. Okay. Okay, so the technical equipment seems to be back. We have come to a point where we can state that based on the information of the Minister of Health and the Minister of Justice, that the producers themselves have admitted to the EMA that they don't know whether the vaccination is effective and whether it has adverse effects. The same is part of the contracts, and the contracts also say that they are not liable for anything. And according to my training as a legal person, these contracts are annulled. And if we still find that this is deliberately done, then we have a deliberately unethical situation with a different kind of immunity, with it's a question whether the people who are responsible for this can protect themselves. For me, it's absolutely impossible. They will all be liable. But let's go for the concrete word. One thing is clear: this can only lead to an immediate stop of all vaccination and immediate exclusion of the cooperation with the people who are responsible. If it is EMA, if it's the EU, we have to separate from them immediately. So let's look at the data. Minister of Interior, have you found something?
Yes, I have got some information here. One preliminary remark: we have to find those agreements. I'm not sure if they're in my ministry, whether they're in the Chancellery with the former Chancellor. I have to ask all of my colleagues to see whether they have access to those agreements, where they are. So we have had a few analyses compiled, so we see something from the US here concerning the damage. This is by the competent authority. This is probably only a fraction of the cases, but you can see from the US database 𝗴𝗺𝗺 that tracks the numbers of deaths related to vaccination. So from 1992 to 2020, it was a very low rate, a very low bottom, maybe 100 people per year or something like that. And now it seems it exploded since the application of the corona vaccination. It went way up to this nearly 10,000 people. And we have to expect that it is actually a lot more, because as we know, these databases usually only collects 1 to 10% of all cases. We can't see right now.
And we have a correction of this figure by our colleague Tom Renz, who was told by a whistleblower who said it's not right, that it's at least 45,000, and these are the official figures, these official 45,000. And here, as you say, this matches that only 1 to 10% of all the cases are reported here. In the normal situation, is, as in the years before, is that the counter effects are reported, and now in the conditions we are in now are not reported, or it's deliberately suppressed that they are reported. And so if we calculate this, we've got Dr. Zelenko, who told us at least 500,000 of deaths after the vaccination, even more possibly.
I can't be sure about this. We'll have to look into this in more detail, but we can certainly say that the reported cases already represent an exorbitant increase, and I have some other stats here, and this is from July 2021. On the 9th of July 2021, we tried to get more up-to-date data. We're at nearly 11,000 dead in the US, but 551,000 severe or other collateral consequences for the UK. As per 1st of July, we have a number of 1,440 deceased and nearly 1.1 million. We can maybe jump to slide 25 where we can see this. Here we see more than 1 million cases of collateral damage in the UK, and if we look at the EU, 17,500 dead and nearly 1.7 million collateral damage cases. So that's quite significant.
And this has the same precaution that only 1 to 10% of the cases are reported at all.
Exactly. If we go back to slide 31 now, we can see that with COVID deaths, this is data from Austria, that the people deceased of Corona, if we take a look at the age range 0 to 24 years, there's practically no people deceased. And in the US, where it's broken down by gender and age, you can see that among the children and young people who have virtually no risk, there are significant collateral damages and deaths. And in the group of 6 to 17-year-olds, since 2016, you can see on the right-hand side, there is a huge jump now that vaccinations are administered to the 12 to 16-year-olds.
For this, I would like to, before we look at the concrete medical incidents, I would like to ask the Minister of Health, these figures that we are seeing here seem to be fully out of the normal range, in inverted commas, especially if, as a layman, I look at the COVID figures. Let's see it positive tested with or without symptoms. They are far behind the figures that we see after the vaccination in side effects in COVID illnesses. Could it be, because I remember your presentation, could it be that the immune system with the respiratory illnesses in the mouth and nose area, the immune system catches everything? So that means this includes the spike protein, which is especially hazardous. Could it be the case that by circumventing this natural immune system, by vaccinating the spike protein directly into the body, which is not staying in the place of vaccination, but spreads around the full body according to what the producer says, could it be that this spike protein is made hazardous by this type of infection? So would, under normal consequences, the immune system would catch it in the mouth-nose area, and by it injecting it into the body, it becomes a problem?
Well, spikes with normal corona infections normally don't make their way to the bloodstream. It's really 0.0% of grave courses, severe courses of the disease, and of course, this can, the way that it's, that the vaccination is administered can make its way to the bloodstream, of course, and this is obvious. That was publicized in January. The injection means that that the spike proteins get into the bloodstream, and of course they're highly toxic, leading to several collateral consequences in different organs. So the micro bloodstream, the smallest vessels, can be clotted, This could be shown, and we got reports from doctors. Some say 30%, others say 50%. Some say in excess of 70% of samples we got. The spikes lead to a decrease of thrombocytes, and this indicates that there is some coagulation somewhere in the body, and then of course we can measure these thromboses. It's been discussed for AstraZeneca the whole time, but it also applies to all the others. The spikes are used by all vaccinations. They're simulated, their creation is stimulated in all vaccinations, so we now have to evaluate the large increase of collateral damage with the vaccinations. So we have to take into consideration that there's largely ever been so many vaccinations, so of course you have more collateral cases. So we have to see how many collateral cases per vaccination do you have, and that is exponentially higher than with other vaccinations. We have collateral damage with collateral effects, side effects with all other vaccinations, but we cannot explain away the large number with these vaccinations now, and it is obvious that particularly toxic reactions are created by these injections, which normally doesn't happen in an injection, and therefore this may make people ill and cause their death.
Could it be the case that research globally that had to look at this for the producers and the certification authorities, that these researchers globally mistakenly overlooked this problem, that by accident they didn't do the toxicological research, which would then have proven the hazardousness of the spike protein?
Well, researchers performed experiments. They had projects to show the threat level of spike proteins, and they always did that in order to show that the coronaviruses are dangerous because they have these spikes, but that the vaccines have these spikes or stimulate the production of these spikes. That is really cynical not to mention this. I asked with one manufacturer, and they said yes, but the spikes are only generated in the muscles where the injection is given, and that is untrue. And 𝗵𝗺 company has shown with their distribution study from Japan, they knew it themselves that they are all over the body. We don't know exactly where.
That is something I didn't know, for example. So that is something understandable for every layman. If on the one hand, as a researcher, I warn against the hazardousness of the coronavirus because it contains that spike protein, on the other hand, as the same researcher, I can't say it is harmless if I take exactly this spike protein, which is normally caught by the immune system, and put it directly into the body. That doesn't seem to be explainable with a mistake, in my view.
Well, I got feedback from gynecologists. They took a look at lymph nodes in women. There are axillary lymph nodes near this place where the injection is made. They have a large number of swelling in the lymph nodes, so anyone who looks at this, palpitating the lymph nodes, etc., that shows clearly that this happens. This is undisputed, that this mRNA doesn't stay where it is injected, but that it spreads around the body, and that leads to these toxic consequences and deaths.
I have a technical question. These proteins, when they are in the blood, do they get into the brain, or is there another barrier?
No, they go across the brain barrier. That's why we have the sinus vein thrombosis as one of the frequent complications, and blood goes through the brain, of course, and when it's through the capillaries, the blood pressure is very low because the head is above the heart, so there is a better protection against the contact is better, but this is why we have relatively frequent strokes and thromboses. I've also heard about visual failure, so I got that report that somebody can't see very well anymore because something was damaged behind the retina, and there was something that swelled up, and that seems to have been in the brain. So whenever you have these reactions, you have minor failures. Sometimes there are minor failures that aren't noticed at all. Sometimes it leads to stroke, depending on whether the thrombosis grows. So if there is a blockage, then of course the clottage can increase. So these are frequent complications. And there are observations based on these blood examinations, which aren't done systematically. Really, 𝗕𝗀𝗺𝗃𝗍 Institute should have ordered these to be done regularly. And the fact that they're not done shows that those who performed them found that these microthrombosis in at least 30% of vaccinees.
We've got the images of a national football player of the Danish football team. He played for some other team on the pitch. By now it is clear that he was vaccinated before, and that such an inflammation, myocarditis, was found. And by now, the doctors, Dr. Charles Hoff from Canada and Dr. Ryan Cole from Idaho in the US and others, we've heard that certain parts of the body cannot be repaired if they are damaged by the spike protein.
That includes the brain.
So that's heart, spine.
Well, the nervous system, the central nervous system, and above all, the heart muscle. And as we heard, that our vaccination committee said those were all small side effects. No, if the heart muscle is damaged, it is not repaired. The heart remains weakened for life.
So we know this player is never going to come back to the pitch. He tried to get to other clubs. They're not taking him because he needs a defibrillator, and in this case they didn't take him. If this is the case, that this means lifelong damage caused by this poisoning with the spike protein, how can it be that the same people who approve these vaccinations, knowing that the coronavirus is dangerous because of the spike protein, how can the same people say, no problem, we know whether it's effective, whether it's going to have adverse effects? How can that be? Minister, is this correct, right, that the head of the 𝗚𝗎𝗇 worked for the pharma industry before she took on office?
Yes, I heard that as well. She worked with different pharma industry. She was with the WHO. So she went through the pharmaceutical industry, the various institutions administratively until she went to 𝗚𝗎𝗇 now. So just before the pandemic, before the crisis, she was transferred just in time basically to wait this through.
So this can't be seen as a coincidence. As a chancellor, I would think that we have to get to a point that will probably force us to split off the supranational organizations. However, we want to collect some concrete experiences from the medical staff here. You wanted to say something?
I would like to get back to the vaccination committee, the 𝗕𝗃𝗀𝗁, which is attached to the Robert Koch Institute. And it's interesting to see that it was very restrictive concerning child vaccination, and they heard that there are problems with the vaccinations. We heard that from the Justice Minister. So what about this 𝗲𝗃𝗀𝗃? Do we have to expect them to take particular interests, individual interests into consideration, so we can't really rely on their statements? Do we have to ask them to re-evaluate the situation?
Well, who failed where? How come what we've just heard, how could that have happened without anybody objecting? Could you comment on that?
I can't give you a definitive answer now. What's interesting is that the org chart of the RKI, there are some people, there's a desk for central ethics, for stem cell research, there's another desk. Why are all sorts of desks created that I'm not even aware of how efficient they are? Always individual desks that need tax money, and the 𝗲𝗃𝗀𝗃 is supposed to be independent, but of course in order to be so, they need some support. What's more important even, it's a question of recruitment of members of the 𝗲𝗃𝗀 to make sure that there's no conflict of interest, etc. So we have to verify whether this is the case. So how the members of the 𝗲𝗃𝗀 recruited to this vaccination commission? As far as I know, that's formally independent.
Maybe I can comment on that. I'm a member of the patient's representative in the diagnostic commission, and I was seconded there from clubs who send them here, but it's only two, and the two representatives, and the other commissions have this as well, but the 𝗲𝗃𝗀 are appointed by the Minister of Health in combination, in agreement with the federal states. And when I was at Transparency, we had a lot of discussion on this when it was about the vaccination of young girls, on the prevalence of the 𝗲𝗃𝗀, who were closely connected to the vaccination industry. It was a scandal at the time. The ways of work, the procedures were changed, more transparency mechanisms were implemented, and so much more transparency was created there, and that the members were scrutinized, public policies and politicians were allotted to conflicts of interest. This has improved a little, and we've seen that the chair of the 𝗲𝗃𝗀 has presented their opinion again and again, and was very refraining against vaccinating children, but we have a stronger effect of politics here, and that is much more difficult for the members. In the economy, they can say, in business, they can say, we don't want this, but as this is appointed by the ministry, it's difficult for the members who are appointed for a certain term only to contradict the politics, and the minister has a great responsibility here in staffing the committee. Well,
then we should give the political guidelines of the new government.
My proposal would be not to appoint these people by politicians like the National Ethical Commission. It's people who are only on approval of the government, who only say what the government wants to hear. And of course they are scrutinized before, and what we need is the parliament to be as the body, and the opposition in the parliament would be most important here, that there are members who really say what needs to be said, because the opposition sent them there so that conflicts are made transparent here and made visible. So the staffing of such bodies should be made by the parliament and responsible by the parliament. That would be an initial proposal off the cuff that I could make. Maybe the population could be involved in this, and not only the big associations, because there are interests here. So maybe it could be a coincidence, some criteria that should play a role. So we should come up with an independent method of staffing these committees so that people can really speak freely, can contradict, and that all of that is documented so that democratic decisions can be made that everybody who is concerned can understand. I think that's important.
Well, it will be important maybe to have those meetings live, or at least document them on film, because they're subject to corruption otherwise.
Yes, there must be reason if this is not the case.
Well, we need to talk about the Paul-Ehrlich Institute as we speak of vaccinations here. They create obstacles, they suppress information, you can say. I've been monitoring this for a while. We have people who try to sift through the data to find out what's current. And you can see that some deaths are covered by statistics, and they disappear from statistics. So there are dependencies here, as we just heard. And so this role is nearly an alibi function, so you can perform these things, it would seem.
So factual, we have a shadow event here. That means the institutions, from your point of view, are undergone by politics or economics or business, which seems to be the same.
Well, I can't tell really, but there are people who look at these figures on a daily basis and try to draw the conclusions, and again and again there are mismatches. We can say the same about these figures as we found for the figures by the RKI. They serve to suppress data more than, or to confuse data more than to clarify. So we have to take a closer look at these figures. And what do we do with these data? What do we do with the data that are reported? They're just registered, but they're not used as a basis for decision making. What happens to those people? They're not represented as victims of vaccination, but only vaccination events.
But we have the opportunity now to get the concrete figures. We can decide who should provide us with what. So what's on the ground in your area of competency? Care of elderly, what can be observed here? These were the so-called vulnerable groups, which, according to my layman's understanding, shouldn't have been vaccinated at all because they are vulnerable. What happened after the vaccination? Does that correspond to what we heard from the whistleblowers, what we saw in our earlier work in the Corona Committee, 20% of deaths? Does that correspond to what we hear?
Well, again, no data is collected here. We can only can rely on anecdotal evidence from the people who work on the ground. Some people have said that after the vaccinations, the dying started. We can't verify because there's no data collection.
But where does this kind of statement from? It doesn't come from the people who died, but from people who observed it. Who observed it? Was it the people in the elderly homes who report this?
That's individual staff members, usually those who are not vaccinated, who report this, come forward.
And this is not individual cases?
Well, I have some contacts whom I asked to install systematic monitoring and to look closely what happens in detail here. And if you go through the various aspects, many have been mentioned already, it's surprising that infections started after the vaccinations, not only positive tests, but also symptoms kicked in. Then increase of dementia, which might be in the context of microthrombosis in the brain, affecting circulation, increasing forgetfulness and other dementia symptoms, then dizziness, blood pressure attacks, high blood pressure in people who never had a problem with that, then with all sorts of complications, collapse situations, many falls due to dizziness, but also visual impairment, fatigue, lack of motivation, and also poorer wound healing, not only with bed sores, but also with other wounds, such as bladder infections that you normally can control with antibiotic treatment that simply won't go away anymore, that sort of thing. That's are observed by people who have been working in nursing for 30 years.
Not at this frequency.
And all of this is not quantified, it's not captured systematically, and I think...
But the image that you're reporting is from reports directly from the institutions, from people who work in the homes.
People who work there.
And it's a uniform picture. There may be exceptions. Surely we're going to hear something about that certain batches are more risky than others. But that seems to be a uniform picture, that there is more and more reports coming in that after the vaccination, you don't have to overdo it, but if somebody says the big mortality is setting in, we've heard this from other places as well, that heavy adverse effects that have not been seen 30 years before are visible. Is that?
At least my contacts report that to me, and the channels that I use to talk to the professions, including many physicians who subscribe to the channel, nursing and hospital staff. There are 65,000 staff members of nursing and health services. That includes doctors, practitioners, and they observe what do people present with. They have symptoms as you would not have seen so frequently in the past.
One question, you're savvy about the rates of people in homes. In some states, the rate is higher of people living in care homes. I've heard that suddenly there's lots of free spaces from the start of the year, from the start of the vaccination. What is your findings here? Do you have any figures?
Again, there is no data collection in this context, only anecdotal stories that you get, and you can try to figure out what's happening. The fact is that anyone who can
De facto ist, dass tatsächlich fast jeder Versuch, der es irgendwie vermeiden kann, nicht ins Heimaufenthalt zu vermeiden, weil das ist, Heime haben sich hier als schwierige Plätze herausgestellt. Das ist dann bestimmt mehr standort, ist regional, denke ich, schon so, aber nicht generell. Es gibt noch nach wie vor, weil wir haben in der Pflege die Situation, dass wir in Deutschland kaum eine Alternative haben. Also ein Drittel der heute Pflegebedürftigen sind quasi darauf angewiesen, in einer Einrichtung leben zu müssen. Und das ambulante System ist einfach hier auf Angehörige, also die stützen sich auf die Angehörigenhilfe und auf Illegale sozusagen aus Osteuropa oder auf Halbillegale oder Menschen, die dann eben hier für einen bezahlbaren Preis We have a situation where when we talk about nursing, there's always been a nursing crisis, but now this is reaching a point where people are nearly left to their own devices, unless something very fundamental happens now, because after the vaccinations there's a lack of personnel. The lack of personnel has become worse. 2/3 or 80% of nursing staff have been vaccinated, also because there is more, there's a higher sick leave rate, and many desert the profession, and if we have an increase of this crisis, then more people will leave the profession, and then who will look after patients if you have the staff ill or left?
We've got reports from the US, and this is also confirmed by the doctor from Idaho, that due to the pressure in the medical professions, in the institutions, a large number of medical staff simply resigns from their jobs, and if that is comparable to other countries, including Germany, that is going to lead to massive problems. What's the situation on the ground in real life from your point of view, Dr. Sarnes?
Wie sieht denn die Situation on the ground, also im realen Leben aus Ihrer Sicht, Dr. Sarnes?
What we just heard here. May actually be considered breathtaking.
Dass es einem die Luft nimmt, und ich postuliere jetzt einfach mal, dass die Informationen, die wir speziell von der Justizministerin bekommen haben, dass die deutschen Ärzte das nicht wissen. Die haben Vertrauen auf die Aussagen der ehemaligen Regierung, des Gesundheitsministers, auf die Statements des �å𝗺𝗺𝗂𝗺 und der EMA, und haben angefangen zu impfen. Und wenn ein Arzt einem Patienten gegenübersteht und ihn impft, dann geht er von der Voraussetzung aus, er impft ihn, dass er ihm eine Immunität erzeugt. Natürlich muss er dort abwägend auch Risiken, er muss also auswählen, ob es nicht eventuell Patienten gibt, die gar nicht impftauglich sind und so weiter. Aber dass wir hier so ein dramatisches Missverständnis zwischen Risiko und Nutzen haben, das weiß nach meiner festen Auffassung kein Arzt in Deutschland. Ich will vielleicht da einsteigen, dass ich den Begriff, den der Gesundheitsminister schon eigentlich hinreichend erklärt hat, aber den Begriff der Herdenimmunität mal aufgreife. Weil dieser Begriff ist eigentlich ein fester epidemiologischer Begriff, der auch seine Definition hat. Der wird an die Situation angepasst, er wird aber jetzt in dieser Situation hier erstmals als ein politisches, psychologisches Argument verwendet. Unter der Vorstellung, dass die Bevölkerung sich etwas darunter vorstellen kann und dass Ergebnis sehen wir, das ist eigentlich schon der erste psychologische Schaden, der angerichtet wird, dass nämlich die Herde, Menschen wie eine Herde zum Impfstand gehen und sich im Impfzentrum impfen lassen. Und in diese Herde werden jetzt also aufgrund der jüngsten Entscheidung auch Kinder eingeordnet. Und das ist eine dramatische Situation, weil wir uns natürlich darauf vorbereiten müssen, insbesondere vor dem Hintergrund der heutigen Informationen, dass wir in absehbarer Zeit ganz große Probleme bekommen. Diejenigen, die mit Problemen ins Gesundheitswesen müssen, also in die Klinik müssen, zu ihren Ärzten müssen, die treffen auf ein seit Jahren ausgehungertes Gesundheitssystem. Finanziell ausgeblutet, viele Krankenhäuser insbesondere, die in der Fläche sind an der unteren Grenze ihrer Möglichkeiten, ihrer finanziellen Möglichkeiten und damit natürlich auch ihrer personellen Möglichkeiten. Und wenn dann diese Patienten mit den Komplikationen kommen, die ersten Komplikationen haben wir erlebt, Thrombosen mit allen Folgen, also Schlaganfälle, Herzinfarkte,
Those are the early complications that we have within the time window within the first 4 and 6 weeks after the vaccination.
Das sind ja die Frühkomplikationen, die wir also in einem Zeitfenster haben,
we have the first Corona outbreaks or breakthroughs, as they're called now. They're not breakthroughs because, let me remind you, we have no Corona period now. It's the middle of August. Corona actually is not epidemiologically active. This will only happen in the late fall, in the winter. That's the Corona time. So what we have are Corona symptoms that are obviously induced by the vaccinations. There are no breakthroughs. There are no vaccination failure. We heard that, but as vaccination isn't successful, it can't fail either.
So it's just positive test results, really.
Well,
however, with symptoms, that is, I think, important to note, and I tried to clarify this. If everything is caught here and as now it's injected, and that leads in a time where Corona does not play a role, epidemiology, in summer, that in context or temporal context of the injection, this Corona symptoms and the side effects of spike proteins in the body emerge, we can't expect that this is a consequence of the illness, of the disease which is caught here, but we have to at least check whether it is not caused by injection itself.
That's really simple to check. It's really very easy to do. If I observe the cases that come along with a positive test in hospitals or in practices, they may be patients who have been received vaccination or not, and I can see if they're ill or not, and I can count it. And if I find that the people who have been vaccinated are sicker than the people who haven't been vaccinated, if they're present, well, then it must be the vaccination. So after a certain number of such observations, I know that it comes from the vaccination. And this is not done because the doctors who administer the vaccinations, monitoring the patients, they would incriminate themselves because they administered the vaccination. And I saw it recently as well. I asked a doctor in a hospital to measure the thrombocytes. I want to know the blood picture because I want to know whether it's a breakthrough, and I want to see whether there were microthrombosis, and he said, leave it to us, that's a appendicitis, we'll take it out, thank you very much. And this clinic is also a vaccination center. They have no interest in these things coming to light. It's really disastrous how things are happening these days.
That's something that needs to be stopped immediately, yes. And if we look at the complications, so now we're getting to a period where we don't know what's coming up. The health minister has talked about the cytokine storm, so we have to expect that banal or simple infections may lead to sepsis or things like this.
Phased and after vaccination.
Maybe even after the influenza vaccination, maybe it could harm or unbalance the immune system in a way that we have consequences that have not been there before.
So you need another vaccination after the corona vaccination. It's a reaction to the corona.
Yes, and if we have an economically feeble health system and a health system where doctors and nurses are vaccinated themselves, so to a large extent they may be absent, possibly, and that may turn into a problem. So that is a very difficult situation. Maybe I could just briefly report about Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, a German state. There was a letter sent to the state government where the university in Rostock said that the intensive care wards for the children are usually close to larger institutions cannot work because of economic and staff restrictions, so they cannot have a shift operation. That's a disaster, really, especially against the background that we are asked to vaccinate children now. And I'd like to remind you that the first outward patients in the stations are coming in, and statements here are that children from 12 years on can be also vaccinated if the parents do not agree. I think the Ministry of Justice has to take a clear stand here as far as liability is concerned.
There's another aspect as well. There are considerations by Bertelsmann Foundation, for instance, or Mr. Lauterbach, the health expert of the SPD, claiming that the hospitals would have to be closed. Before this started, that was a big issue. Mr. Lauterbach, who was a representative and a lobbyist for Helios and others, where I saw, I visited Helios with him, where I saw that he has a good understanding with the management there. He always claimed that we have too many hospitals, that we have to close them, and we can do that, so we can increase the percentage of utilization of hospital beds, and in order to achieve that, you just reduce the number of beds, and you have a higher percentage, or you simply take staff from the system, then you have fewer hospital beds available, and you increase the capacity utilization.
Das ist eine perfide Strategie möglicherweise, die dahinter steckt. Und wir wissen ja, dass der Markt, der Monopolmarkt bei der Gesundheitsversorgung sehr brutal ist. Wir haben ja kaum die kommunalen Krankenhäuser und die gemeinnützigen, die werden immer weniger und die privaten werden immer mehr. Und da ist ein großes Bestreben, diese Gesundheitsversorgung, auch die stationäre, die ja besonders lukrativ ist, zu monopolisieren. Und das sehen wir, das kann man im Rahmen dieser Strategie der Naomi Klein, kann man das nicht nur beim Schulsystem in New Orleans sehen, sondern wir sehen es derzeit im Gesundheitssystem in Deutschland.
Labour Minister, I know that you had closures in East German state where you have very long access distances for people going to a hospital, and that is something that we really have to consider. How long can people actually drive if they have a terminal constipation, or they have a thrombosis, or a stroke? If people have to go 100 kilometers to the nearest hospital, I mean, that is a time-crucial aspect.
Well, in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, where we had the horrible predictions, many of the hospitals were closed, 27 of them, and step by step, 200 hospitals in Germany. Yes, 200 hospitals were closed in Germany.
200?
No, 27, not 200, 27. And of course, first of all, those which were not profitable in the rural areas, and where I said patients per kilometer, so that's of course more profitable in a urban area to run a hospital rather than a rural area, and this was the 𝗵𝗺𝗺𝗃 hospital, which was closed in September, which had a number of beds, and now a large part of the population cannot be taken care of medically. And just as the Minister of Interior said, I wanted to ask Dr. Wannes, who benefits if the health system and the health supply is reduced in Germany? Hospitals are closed, intensive care beds are shut down, and the staff, due to the pressure, the psychological pressure, and in their personal health, these people are put at hazard or even damaged. Who benefits from this? Surely not the population, because they have no health supply anymore. So who benefits here, because it's less money that is spent, although the same money should come in? So who benefits? I think this is something that we need to investigate into.
Well, clearly, those who provide the money, the health insurance companies, we can clearly say that. It's not only in the context of closures, but also in the context of the Hospital Financing Act. The regulations are becoming ever more stricter, where staff don't get pay rises, etc. And when a hospital comes to a point where it can't work profitably anymore, then it has to be closed. And then, of course, we can see that it is one of the big employers in rural areas. It's of no interest to anyone. It's a simple question of mathematics. At the end, it's a question of how much money can you earn with it. And the big clinics always claim that we can cover this. This is one of the worst misunderstandings in health coverage, but it is something that the federal government keeps claiming. The idea of closing hospitals for the benefit of large centers, that is an idea that seems to have become commonplace. So let me get back to what I was saying earlier.
Ja, aber vielleicht gestatten Sie mir, dass ich meine Ausführungen nochmal abschließe. Wir haben uns nämlich
the health minister had said it before. We are preparing a motion for a decree where doctors are
veranlasst werden, bei jeder Konsultation in einer Praxis
obliged to ask about the vaccination status whenever a patient presents in order to collect data on any collateral damage that aren't even well known. And I would like to refer back to the Black Death by 𝗵𝗺𝗺𝗃. The most important thing in combating a disease is to know about it. So if we don't know about it, then we can't make any progress. So we need to have people who know what they're doing. May I say something concerning the data? It's not like there isn't any data available. We have data collection options like never before. And the data are collected, but they don't wind up with the authorities and those responsible for health cover, but the data arrive at those who program apps, the data hosts, and all this testing and vaccinations. Collect data, contact data, and all this data, if you have the big machines, and the data industry has availability of these machines covering the medical, the health system, there was never more data about the health development in Germany, particularly in the context of the developments of Corona. Never before did we have so much data, but we don't have the data, the government doesn't have the data, not the health insurance companies have it. And probably those companies that run the data centers have the data. That's our data, but the data flow has been privatized or through public-private partnership. You never know who, you always know who has the say, i.e. the people who bring the money. And we have to change this. We have to make sure that the data, which is really important data, data that doctors can collect, is collected in a relevant way. It doesn't have to be attaching names to it. Now this is done. What happens now? The companies, battlers know exactly who has what, who got what, who needs what. It's much more transparent for industry than for the public health service. We don't need personalized data. We need population data so we can see developments and trends, and this is completely underutilized today. So data is collected, but not by those and for those who actually are responsible for good health provision. The RKI should have the data so that we, as the new government, can achieve this transparency for the population. Is it correct, Health Minister, that nobody but the manufacturers know what's in the individual batches of the, or what is in those vaccines? Yes, that's another big issue that really worries me. I am preparing an analysis at the Paul-Ehrlich Institute to see how this is organized, how the collateral, the side effects are collated, and we have to do that together with the states. And that's why I am going to hold a conference with the states' health ministers in order to see what are the side effects, what could be in those vaccines, what is in these vaccines, or are the companies running secret experiments with us, with the population, because there's no ethics commission that's involved here. We simply have vaccines in huge batches, and the companies know what's in these batches, nobody else knows. And I asked Paul-Ehrlich before we were in government, and the answer was, well, we rely on the data provided by the producers, by the manufacturers. Well, then we had a slide earlier where it said that an analysis from America shows that 75% of cases where there were collateral damage stemmed from 10% of the batches, and we know from these events in the nursing home in Berlin, of the 10 people, 8 people died. Very soon after the vaccination of 30 people, and 4 got a vaccine, a shot from a jab, from a single vial. So it's a bit like Russian roulette. Well, it's only a Russian roulette for us. If the manufacturers know what's happening, then all speaks in favor of having a huge medical experiment being performed with an innocent population. Well, it always sounds like a conspiracy theory, but when it comes to control and oversight of a good supply, then people need to be able to rely on the fact that they can rely on this. And what we now have is lack of transparency, inefficient monitoring. I want to know from the Paul-Ehrlich Institute whether they rely on the producers' indications when it comes to the ingredients of batches, or do they rely on laboratory testing by independent laboratories? And with cancer medication, we only found out about mass cases of deaths with 𝗏𝗏𝗏. We only learned about that through whistleblowers. So, where is the oversight for immunological vaccinations for SARS-CoV-2? When are analyses performed? Are all batches analyzed or only random batches? How is it done? How often? Where? What are you looking for? If somebody says there are new toxins in this, what do you look for? What don't you look for? And then the question: where is the documentation of the results? Those are questions that the Paul-Ehrlich Institute has to answer now. And we can ask these questions now. And we need to get these answers. Well, couldn't there be some consumer protection agencies that monitor this, just like with the food industry, where they analyze sausages or whatever? Well, the question is, the Paul-Ehrlich Institute is a consumer protection institute. Well, I have great concerns that Paul-Ehrlich Institute, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, the Health Ministry, the vaccination manufacturer. What we're talking about is always central institutions. It's 𝗏𝗏, who may or may not publicize findings. From my point of view, it's always top-down. We always depend on whether there's a whistleblower. How can we always rely on whistleblowers? And I would like to make a point. our
dass wir
health
davon abhängig sind, ob es
system
einen Whistleblower
depends
gibt. Und ich möchte einfach nochmal
on
feststellen, also unsere Gesundheitsversorgung ist einfach
vaccine
nur davon
manufacturers
abhängig,
produce what they
dass
claim to produce.
Impfstoffhersteller das produzieren, was sie
Consumers
vermeintlich
need to
produzieren
be
sollten, dass
informed about
Ärzte überhaupt
what
darüber aufgeklärt werden
what they're receiving,
und
what
sich ein
vaccines they
echtes Bild
receive,
darüber
and that
machen können,
depends.
was sie da überhaupt
And that's
initiieren.
what the
Und daran
infrastructure,
hängt die
the entire
gesamte Wirtschaft, daran hängt die
capability of
gesamte
survival
Infrastruktur
of a region
und die
depends.
gesamte
Well,
Überlebenskapazität
we as
einer
a
Region.
government cannot be
Aller
left
Regionen.
to wonder what we can tell the population what's in their vaccines. That's not acceptable.
Was wir der Bevölkerung mitteilen
So
können,
we
was in den
will,
Impfdosen drin ist. Das kann einfach
issue
nicht
the
sein.
appropriate
Also
decrees, Mr. Cohen,
wir
to
werden
make
die
sure that
entsprechenden,
the
wir werden die
institutions
entsprechenden
attached to your
Anweisungen erteilen,
institute, such as the Pollen
Herr
Institute,
Cohn,
do the right
damit die
thing. We
gerade auch in Ihrem
can't
Hause angesiedelten
accept the situation
Institutionen wie
that some
Paul-Ehrlich-Institut,
people in key
damit sie das
positions
Richtige tun. Es
simply
kann
block
nicht sein, dass
everything
da Leute sitzen, die
and
offenbar alles
analyze only in
ausbremsen
favor of
und nur noch für die
industry.
Industrie
And that was why I asked the
Geheimhaltung
question.
betreiben.
It's only
Denn
a
das ist
question
der Eindruck,
of
der sich hier
topping up
aufdrängt. Und
one on
deswegen
one.
meine
If we
Frage
have to
vorhin, Herr
assume, and
Bundesminister,
that's
war
what
einfach
we
nur das
are
Zusammenzählen
assuming
von
right now,
1
that
und
nobody
1.
but the
Wenn wir
manufacturers
davon
know what
ausgehen
the
müssen,
vaccines
und davon
contain.
gehen
If
wir
we
jetzt aus,
also
dass
have to
niemand
assume, and we do
außer den
assume this
Herstellern
now,
weiß,
that the
was
individual
in den
national
Impfdosen
governments, not
drin
only
ist.
ours,
Wenn
but
wir
all the others as
außerdem
well,
davon ausgehen müssen, und davon gehen wir jetzt aus,
secret
dass die
agreements with
einzelnen
exactly
nationalen
these
Regierungen, nicht nur unsere,
vaccine
sondern alle anderen
manufacturers who
ebenfalls,
say we don't
geheim
know
gehaltene
if
Verträge
it's
abschließen
effective, we
mit
don't know
genau
what the
diesen
side effects are, and
Impfstoffherstellern,
we
die unter anderem sagen, wir wissen
reject
nicht, ob es
all
wirkt, wir wissen nicht,
liability.
was für Nebenwirkungen es hat,
And
und
if
wir
we
lassen
also
uns
see that
freistellen von
large
jeglicher
parts,
Haftung.
which are the
Und
batches
wenn wir
that
dann
cause
noch
this
sehen,
this
dass
damage,
große Teile, was
well,
war
10% of
die,
batches
die
cause
Chargen, die
75%
da die großen
of
Schäden
damages.
verursacht haben?
Well, then the only conclusions can be that here
Da kann sich doch keine andere
private industry, possibly because of
als dass
public-private
hier
partnership,
im
which of course
privaten
focuses
Bereich
on
möglicherweise aufgrund dieser
those who
Public-Private
have the
Partnerships,
money,
die das
i.e. the
Übergewicht natürlich
private
auf der
partner,
Seite des Geldes,
that
also
this
bei den
leads to
Privaten,
a
dass hier
large-scale experiment.
derzeit ein
That's the
groß
only
angelegter
conclusion I have.
Versuch abläuft.
Well, I
Es kann
had
sich
this
für mich
suspicion
kein anderes
before I was
Ergebnis
part of
daraus
the
ergeben.
government, that this emergency situation is, of course, ideal for all these big biotech and vaccination companies to try out things they never dared try before. And things that they cause themselves, as we found. They cause a problem that they solve themselves then.
Den sie selbst verursacht haben, wie wir inzwischen festgestellt haben. Sie
We've
verursachen ein
heard of
Problem,
these
das sie dann selbst lösen.
self-replicating vaccines that that pharmaceutical companies wanted to try out for a long time. We can't do that though, testing it on people. But if somebody wants to try this because they want to have a lead over people, they just try it. They get the data from Google and companies, from BasisCamp and all that collect data through the apps. So they know which were a control group. That's the possibility. Nobody would know this now. I'm thinking in criminal terms now, but as a health minister, I owe this to the population to preclude this abuse. And people have to be able to rely on the fact that this is not possible. I couldn't guarantee it now because we don't have the data available. Because we don't collect the data because nobody tells us. We don't even know who has the data. We don't know who performed which analyses with what results. Those are things that we have to clarify. How was that possible? Do we expect? That's my concrete suspicion. Do we have to assume that the previous government had no respect of the interests of the population, but only of the interests of business? You can see that at WHO. The ambassadors to Geneva represent their countries there. Sometimes the health ministers can be there, and you can clearly see that for most countries, economic interests prevail. So the economic factor, market health system is what's discussed there, and who should have access, who shouldn't. So it's about the economic competition between the various countries there, and that is how the entire health system is organized. The entire health system has become a health market. So the question is, how can we earn money with health coverage? And of course, the more disease there is around, the more money you can make. And if the governments get involved and engage in precautionary action, then they can destroy this business model.
I would like to comment one thing. We need another access to the reports that are coming into the archive. I think the batches are reported there, and we have to make sure that this is the case, and that we can see where are there regional clusters of problems. Maybe that's in the cities. Where is these things? Where are the batches used? And maybe we even need to change the mandatory reporting. We need the data. Yeah, I have one question to Mr. Koch. And that's one thing, Mr. Cohen. I want to have the positive quota laboratory based. I want to know where are the clusters of positive results. Are there any? We don't have that. We know the 200 laboratories. Maybe there is also this information available. It's just not published, so it's easy to see where the positive rate is high. I noted that Thüringen seems to be only a few laboratories that work with a lot of positive tests. That changes from the others, and so there are things that point out to see that there are differences. What is counted? Why is the results different? Why are there no uniform standards so far for the assessment of the PCR tests? Why do we not know which laboratory works with which CT value, with how many primers, and with which primers? The primers, well, we want to clarify this, but maybe we can do this to understand what was going on, to understand it, but also to make people liable, because the suspicion is getting bigger and bigger that here we are not facing incidental errors, but with organized criminality. The herd immunity that we are started with is starting to herd idiocy or organized crime. I think this is the finding that is emerging more and more clearly. We're surely going to have to hear some details, but I think these details are not going to change much in the overall picture as we're seeing it now. I think another thing is important here. We have to look at the interests that lie behind this, because you, Ms. Frau von Stresser, you noted that we do not know how it emerges that the Paul-Ehrlich-Institute loses deaths, so we have to look who has access to the raw data and who does changes to that database, and we have to clarify this to see where whatever kind of influence is taken. Well, whether it's Robert Koch Institute, we have no independent control. They can do with the data whatever they want. Are there concrete hints to this, that deaf people have been eliminated from the database and so? You can look up the Corona blog homepage. I know some of the people who research this regularly. They keep this. They have every single report and report it. We've got the reports, we looked at them, and we found apparently there is fewer deaths. Well, I'm asking, it could be the case that if the reported cases are available, that certain criteria, cost checks are made, so plausibility, and that may lead to some changes, because some may not be plausible. Theoretically, that could be possible. But we have the same reports from the US, that here in the statistics, the number of deaths is manipulated by older deaths coming in and new ones are putting in instead of adding them simply to the roll. That is the situation that we have to follow up on. After what we know by now, we cannot simply expect that this is some kind of coincidence or accidental mistakes. This is things that need to be clarified up in all detail. Of course, we have to check the flow of data, and the data flow has to be monitored and controlled. The question also is whether this fully digitalization of all databases is necessary. It is, of course, good a beneficiary, but that some data for vaccinations or others that are person-related, that they may be left in regional, communal, municipal responsibilities even, or that one may check to have a central set of data which is analog, because this is data that can be understood later on. Everything else, once it's out of the flow, it's gone. Yes, a very good point. I think that many small mistakes are made at the same thing, make the same mistake, but that one central place doing a mistake with the fatal consequences is much better. If we have 400 communities in Germany, if something comes up that's different than in all others, that could be checked. So by the many people responsible, that will create more dependability. It only has to be made sure that the criteria to pick up and collect the data and process the data, that they are always the same, that the equipment is the same, that errors don't get in because people don't know how to work the systems, or the machines are not there, but that will be noted and that could be corrected. So that if it's central, it's very easy to manipulate it, and that does not only apply to elections, it applies to immunology as well. I'd like to point out one problem. Dr. Zanis referred to a problem in the health system that we may be facing with staff numbers. We have another problem which concerns me greatly in my area is, of course, the police, who have been largely vaccinated. Also here, we may have the problem that many officers may be absent, and this also applies to the teachers and the kindergarten teachers and so on. So maybe we are running into a vaccination population issue here, which affects many fundamental areas, essential areas of the population. So the question is, what can we do? So after what we've heard so far, we can't just sit and wait for things to happen. I think we seriously have to prepare for a difficult autumn with severe consequences, vaccine-based, not corona-based, and we can only prepare to this by, other than the former government, not ignoring the problem, but saying we need clinics, we need hospitals that are specialized on these consequences of the vaccination, which seem to be intended, as to my perception so far. Mr. Chancellor, there's one more important thing to note. If companies like hospitals, and they pressurize their staff to get vaccinated, there is an insurance. The companies have to have a work safety authority, and the contributions, the policy depends on the height of the damage and the problems. So that means the companies want to keep work safe as possible, but now if they send their people to the so-called vaccination, then I think they have to know show that the damage caused by this will have to be compensated by their contributions to the health, to the work, occupational safety insurances, and that is only relative to the employer who forces them. Of course, those who don't do it are on the good side, but this is a feedback loop that we really need. This is something we have to know if we talk about regulation of vaccine damage. I think if our analysis shows that the vaccination creates more damage than benefit, we'll have to re-evaluate this by the 𝗕𝗃𝗀𝗁 or other activities. That this vaccination in Germany is not just voluntarily. There must not be any pressure, but they must be taken off the market, and it must be prohibited. We know from yesterday there's no basis, and from today we know that there's not only no basis, but apparently it is highly hazardous, so we have to prohibit them. And the vaccination industry knows that we want to do this, and they are really getting the full market approval, not the emergency approval. They want to do everything to do that, so that only by a political decision the license becomes void. So they are working for this and making sure this. Yes, I've seen this. The Americans are discussing this now without public hearings, simply to provide the final licensing. That is another reason for us to say we really have to detach from the supranational institutions, take our own regime, and in cooperation with the other national states, in exchange, understand and decide what is right and what is wrong. It can't be the case that any new supranational bodies tell us what we should do or what not. Mr. Chancellor, we can do this immediately. We can stop this immediately in Germany, yes. Due to an existing danger, and that is something we can do. So, if that was possible with Contagan or Silinuma at the moment, it took as long, it can't be taking as long after the damages that we are already seeing, which are much bigger than what happened with Silinuma at the time. I think it's also going to be important that we create a hotline for people who, after vaccination, see adverse effects now and are not sure whether it could be anonymous, that people undercover want to get informed because they may be afraid and to speak up and speak out. Or as with the doctor doesn't listen to them, or the doctor doesn't want to hear. So we need a hotline where people can contact people, and we need a campaign to inform about possible damages caused by vaccination. Many people may say it was the right thing to do, or I did it because I was pressurized. I'm going to meet with the medical chambers and the state governments. We have to develop a training for the damage recognition of vaccinations, qualifying doctors to really detect real vaccination damages and to develop issues on how to protect people and what to do about it. This is something that these bodies need to organize. That can be done quite quickly. We just need to find savvy doctors, and there are quite a few. We take care that doctors are trained who can do this and probably would do this. Of course, it has to be paid for, obviously, but this is something that we have to take care of with the different states. I would like to take the role of the official health institutions who are, as far as the vaccinations are concerned, we have to work differently here, that we do not just make sure that everybody can get vaccinated, but also see what happens to the people. And that can be extended if we do this now by the vaccination and we have the competency on the ground, then we can develop this for other pharmacovigilance projects, and the doctors can be sensitized for things that they prescribe, that there may be adverse effects, and they have to be watched more systematically so that we can find these earlier and do not depend on the research studies which are paid for by the companies and who can decide whether they are published or not. That is a blind flight, really, which is taking much too long until the damages become apparent. Just imagine 𝗏𝗺𝗃, where thousands of people die, although the company had the data, it was just not published. So that was a cardiotoxic medicament. This is something that must not happen, and this is something that we can only find out if not only the doctoral chambers know this, but the doctors themselves are vigilant enough, that are trained enough to see these things. This has to be done with the federal states. That can grow over time, and then we can have a critical vigilance to health, and that's quite healthy. There's many more things above drugs that keep people healthy, and that's something that we may be concentrating on.
So do we have to go back at the end of the day to something original healing methods that have been denigrated?
Well, that's what 𝗏𝗏𝗺 said, build back better. No, we're not going to do that. We know everything that we're going to do in the future is going to be better. It's going to be done new and better. It just needs to be transparent so that everybody can be informed and they can tell us when things go wrong so that we can correct them. Only if we are transparent and we get feedback of things that are doing well and that are not, anything that we can do can be quickly optimized and corrected. But this monopolization of knowledge and not sharing knowledge, being in competition in the health market, that is something that mistakes are covered up that can great damage. So we want transparency.
But that was not my question. My question was, do we have to go back to what worked previously and what only was superseded in 1913 by the creation of the pharmaceutical industry? Do we have to give more attention to that, or should we continue to go down the way of the pharmaceutical industry and the machine industry? Once we've seen what we've seen here, don't we have to take a special new look at this?
I think it's very good how the Scandinavians take the approach. They take the full range of possibility. There's budgets for the different regions, and that is related to the number of inhabitants, and that is spent by common decisions for the people who are responsible for the health system regionally, who say we have to be able to afford expensive medicaments, and they have to have physiotherapists, and that can be done regionally, and the national government only looks for transparency and exchange of information. I think that's a very sensible system. We don't have to do the same thing all over Germany. Why can't Baden-Württemberg have a different region who just has natural doctors, and 𝗏𝗺𝗃 says, no, we want to keep our chemical industry up and we do the pills. So let's see where diabetics do better and where people feel better. I think regional responsibility with transparency will help us to learn, and we can follow best practices. As a federal government, we have a coordinating function here. We have to provide the knowledge, we have to drive research forward, and we have to make sure that the bias created by the sponsors in scientific research is done. And another big topic is patent right, but I think that is something we need to exclude today. However, that has a great effect.
Aber da können wir uns heute nicht drüber unterhalten. Das ist ein eigener Fehlanreiz, der dieses Gesundheitswesen
Nevertheless, let me
beeinflusst.
get back to this
Ich denke,
point again, because in the context of these measures, nearly everything that would have been cheaper than these vaccinations was condemned. Natural healing, of course. So this is another approach that has been discredited for a long time. I'm a very strong defender of natural medicine.
Also ich persönlich bin ein ganz starker Verfechter für Naturmedizin und dafür so wenig Medizin wie irgendwie möglich, so wenig Künstliches, sondern der Natur wirklich hier die Möglichkeit zu geben, die Natur in ihrer Natürlichkeit zu erhalten und zu schützen und auch mit möglichst natürlichen Mitteln da zu operieren.
Might want to integrate it, or if we want to have a complementary type of medicine, then I think this only will work if you look at the results.
Dann
and
funktioniert
we
das
have
meines
to
Erachtens
structure
nur, wenn man wirklich hier so
the health system accordingly to see who heals is right. So we have to focus on the results and always take a look at those.
We've heard a couple of times that corona illnesses, influenza and corona, actually in the first line are a consequence of a vitamin D deficit. So the viruses are there all the time, but in the countries where there's not enough sun during winter times, Scandinavia seems to be strongly affected here, but we are as well. When the vitamin D levels drop, then the illnesses break through. And where in addition we've heard that vitamin C, zinc, certain medication, all long tested and no side effects. That was my question. Of course, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to need hospitals. Of course, I need them for severe diseases or conditions, accidents. But what we have been through here, the fact that an industry with help of contractual agreements makes sure, and that is what the contracts also have.
Auch in den Verträgen drin.
Professor Rupper, you seem to have popped in here. You need to mute yourself. The fact that the whole industry took care that their so-called vaccines are brought to the population here with contractual protection and exclusion of natural remedies shows me that we have to have a close look here and that we cannot simply rely on what the industry tells us, which is, from my point of view, much too close to the old government. This is something that can't go by uncriticized anymore. That needs a close look. So, can we do the regions, establish the hospitals there and make them accountable for regional supply?
Mr. Chancellor, let's not put it this way. Can we build that for the regions? No, the regions should decide for themselves how much they need. And it's very easy to do. And this model that I gave you from Scandinavia, where they have budgets, where every region has to think about how do we spend our money, what do we spend it for, leads to a situation where these regions have a great interest in preventing people from going to the hospitals, that they have a lot of preventive medicine because that saves a lot of money, so people don't go to hospitals in the first place. So they have a lot of cooperation with doctors and nurses. You don't have to have hospitals for this. They organize the cooperation between nurses and doctors without hospitals. They organize it across the region, and then you need fewer hospitals. So that's a subsidiary, a place where subsidiarity comes into play better than anywhere else nearly. And so the region should have a budget and then make transparent what they do with it and make it be responsible vis-a-vis their populations. And those governments, regional governments that do well will be re-elected, those who don't will not be re-elected. If we start trying to control this from the federal level, then it will be as bad as what the old government did. Until we detect the mistakes, everything has changed, and the the regulatory cycles, the transparency that is required would not be possible at the federal level.
May I have a word here? Of course.
Well,
thank you. As we are at the point where it seems to be important to me that this health and illness issue is not just looked at the physical level for the future, please bear in mind that the majority, as my experience from my practical profession tells me, many of the illnesses are a consequence of wrong and people living in relationships that are not good for them. As I mentioned earlier, that people are physically bound in relations that they cannot free themselves from. So a future health system urgently needs the psychological aspects and the relation to the way where people live, what the relations people are in. My experience is that the biggest risk of illness is in living in destructive relationships, and that needs to be made aware to the populations. Currently, it's a taboo. It's better to take some external cause for an illness, and rather than to look at the toxic relationships I live in and the question on how I can change these, I think for the future this is a very important aspect for me, that this is also focused on by the Ministry of Health, and a lot of information work about the real causes here are there, especially with respect to chronic diseases, that until we know that a cancer is healed, if the people can leave the ill relationships that they have.
Well, that seems to be a very important aspect that we never took a look at so far, that the psychological aspect of living in toxic relationships, for instance, that is immediately understandable that this leads to illness. It's not sufficient to look at the physiological consequences only.
Let me just give you an example. I worked with someone who had the diagnosis COVID and is extending, and then I worked with him and found out what the background of their childhood was, what their trauma was, and after the work she was much better. So immediately, so this is something that it's not the drugs, it's not the medication, and it's not natural remedies, but in many cases it's that the people are freed from their internal prison. They're in a split that we offer them an exit strategy so that they can activate their psychological self-healing powers, which have a strong effect on the physical health.
May I make a comment here? Working in the committee, we had the psychoimmunologist, Professor Schubert, and of course, phobias are of course very destructive when it comes to the immune system, and it's important to have a information campaign for the population, that now that they're all living in fear, to make sure that the stress doesn't overwhelm them and make them ill again.
That's, I think it's a good transition to what I wanted to say. What is coming up, on one hand, we have a vaccination that has no basis. We have an expectation of the cytokine storm, besides the side effects, long and short term, of the vaccination. We have to expect that on the labor market and social market, we'll have loads of people who will not able to work due to physical conditions, and we are in a state of fear altogether, and I'll come back to what the president said. We are in the expectation of the fourth wave. Everybody expects that many people will die or will seriously fall sick because of the fourth wave. which can only be counteracted by a fourth lockdown. And this is why we should now set ourselves up to have this fourth wave in a different way and in a positive way, join up by regionally building up things together, create structures that those teachers who have not been vaccinated, the nurses who have not been vaccinated, the doctors who have not been vaccinated, that they can come together to create structures which are able to hold up the system, which may be coming up and endangered by the fourth wave, because the whole system in Europe, in Germany, if of what we're hearing here now, if that turns up, whatever we call it, we can't stop it anymore because the vaccination has been done. But we can set up a system together and in a positive way find solutions that protect us from conditions so that we can keep the system up and running.
Well, I second what the President said. I really appreciate that. And if we try within the Health Ministry to start a campaign that focuses on people's life situation as something that we need to take care of, and where we have to help each other out. And if we start a campaign in that sense, and I'd be very grateful if, Mr. President, you could be the sponsor for such a campaign, because it's not identical for everybody. There are people who are lonely. Some people have very close social restrictions and they can't break out of them. There are people in the countryside, in the cities, and the potential support structures are different from region to region. But to accept that this is an issue and to say, let's talk about how can we make our lives easier that way, those are things that we tend to suppress, and this is something that we need to deal with and we can learn from each other. So I'd appreciate it if you could be the sponsor.
Yes, I'm happy to do so. If I look at new situations psychologically that we're going to face, I think this is an important development that we have to pick up on.
Let me say something that really weighs on me. We're at a point where we are speaking about general health issues. I'm not a legal expert, but let me say that this is clear and present danger. So let's say what in the health system, that in the health system we do something what pharmacies would normally do, that we issue a red letter to report about the things that we heard about the Justice Minister today. As soon as this is widely known, I'd say that the vaccinations will stop. Because those are facts that every doctor can understand, that every citizen will understand, really. So I think the Health Ministry has to intervene here and say, stop, there's no basis for this.
I would like to add a suggestion here. With respect to the vaccination, I think at least a moratorium is due. That would have been my proposal earlier on. We have gone beyond this so far now. And the second point is that this PCR test, which apparently or obviously cannot give us any reliable statement, and if I remember this correctly, the WHO didn't even license it for this diagnostic purposes, that we declare by declaration or whatever that this tests must not be used any longer for diagnostic purposes. I think this is something that we have to take immediate action on, and the last thing would be I can't see what I noted anymore. The test. Well, maybe.
May I briefly intervene here? There may be people who don't want to undergo testing anymore because they're afraid of this. So we might have to take this out of the obligation to report and the tests. We saw yesterday that there are toxicological problems involved. So maybe we would have a warning attached to this, or maybe actually ban people freely getting tests, and then we have this problem of the toxic substances, so they might actually translate into a cancerous issue or destruction of their mucous tissue in the nose.
Yes, just to finish this off, we have to look at how the official bodies will inform the population. Yesterday I read on the website of the Robert Koch Institute the vaccination is harmless and good and effective. That is something that I will take immediate care of and make sure that this is taken offline. This type of information at the moment can't be explained any longer, and if I'm responsible for this, I think I'll take immediate action, and this would apply immediately for all other bodies.
Well, many staff members in your institution will be happy not to have to go along with this nonsense anymore as well.
Maybe I can add or summarize here. Indeed, we are working with a fear virus here. That's a real virus if we take it that far. That is really a wide coverage and cannot be argued away with. So the question is how to get people out of the fear by delivering facts on transparency or by explanation, information in a way which is psychologically adequate so that it can be accepted. So this is something we should sit together and see how to do this psychologically, strategically, to reverse the fear from the population which they have been brought into for the last 1.5 years. This is something that has to be done in parallel. If we simply forbid the tests and prohibit the vaccinations, saying there's no risk,
that's a great idea.
We have to. There's people gonna attack us because they're afraid, saying now they want to kill us.
Well, there's a problem here now. If I ask someone to redesign the websites, it'll take a week to do that and to get the content sorted, to coordinate this and to be technically safe. But I will be liable immediately, and that's why I want to make sure that won't happen. And we have to make sure that the federal government as a whole, not only in my own institution, but also all the other ministries that have spent a lot of money for campaigns, they have to be recalled as well.
That's a crucial point. We really have to differentiate between the whether and the how. Whether is not a question anymore. We know from what we've heard today that an immediate stop of the PCR tests and the vaccination is required. Both of them are inadequate, don't help, and cost a lot of money. We can see that they are hazardous, not how, but that. And we have to be prepared for the consequences of the vaccination. We have no problem, as we see with the Corona pandemic. It's a PCR pandemic, which seems to be a psychological operation in the start, which was then transported with the vehicle of the mainstream media. And thirdly, as far as we can see, we have to take legal action. That's the whether. That this is needs to be done, for me, that's out of question. But the question is how, and that's important, because we have to see that we have to pick up people where they are, and we have to be very, very transparent transparent. We cannot simply do what was done in the past, and we never wanted to do so. We were also against the former policy, so we can't just counter-fear campaign, but we have to leave the decision to the people on how they want to proceed, and that can only be done by transparency, by letting them know what we have found out, and then we can only hope that if we immediately stop the vaccinations and the tests, that the people accept it. We shouldn't do any prohibitions, any punishments, anything like that. We should just look at Germany and get our sovereignty back to recall the license for these PCR tests and the vaccinations with immediate effect.
Well, here, the dilemma becomes obvious. On the one hand, not to disorient the population and confuse the population. On the other hand, we have a responsibility for the information we hand out. It must be correct, and it isn't at this time. That's why I was speaking of a moratorium. So we suspended. It must not be used until we've looked into it in more detail, and we immediately start
bis wir das geprüft haben, und wir setzen gleichzeitig sofort an,
talking to the population.
And of course here a statement of the president is a good thing to create the basis for everything.
Great, will communicate that via the president, who can make a statement just like he did it to start with. But on the basis of everything we've heard today and yesterday, first of all, there is no basis for these measures, much less for these vaccinations. Not only is there a lack of evidence in principle, but it isn't efficacious, it's not harmless, there's no evidence for this. So we have to prepare for worse situations unfolding in the fall, not because of Corona, but because of the vaccinations, and at the end of the day, we will have to hold those responsible who are responsible for this. This must not be overlooked. This time the population has to see that individuals, or maybe numerous individuals, are responsible for will be held liable.
I want to point out one thing. The point is that the hype that was created is strongly sourced by the old government. If we look at the press releases, the personal statements of the respective politicians, it's always Corona is the worst thing that can happen, and our remedy is the vaccination. And so there's a lot of authority that was used to transport these messages. If that is not done by the government anymore, who is in an authority, or how should I put it, a trust as the responsible body, and if the other bodies now in the same intensity send out the information, no, the assessment of the situation has changed, that will create good grounds for us and for the people to start reconsidering the information, because I think many have the information from the media, from positions of the old government. That is all linked up. So I would like to see that newspaper who, although the new government comes up with a new statement, always keeps on writing that it is always the same, it's all harmless. And I think we have to make sure and point out that due to the Drugs Advertising Act, there is prohibited activists. I can't sell sausages together with vaccination. And this is something that the interior ministers of the countries, of the states, and the justice of the states could require post-mortems, and that blockages that are locally, that these trespassers of the law are prosecuted and the respective blocks are released. And I think if we have a concerted action here in this respect, we have to make sure that people who are not convinced right away there may be kind of black market for vaccinations, and people who are obsessive in this way go there, and this is something that has to be prohibited and followed up, that this stops.
What we definitely need to do, I'm against punishable offenses, against bans, because the population has been manipulated for a year and a half. So against this background, I'm against punishing people for certain actions, but people who cannot protect themselves, children and elderly, there we should have should create punishable offenses, because we can't expect them to make appropriate decisions. If, despite the information we provide, somebody wants to get a vaccination, they should get it.
I think it has to be taken off the market, and we cannot leave that up to the individual, because if we assume that another 100,000 people get vaccinated and they create problems because they get sick, that can't be the case. Well, it's always been the case in the history of drugs. If a drug is hazardous, it has to be taken off the market, no question. I'd like to pick up on what the Chancellor just said. You have to differentiate and see where there are vulnerable people, children, and so on, and others are responsible. That has to be a different category here.
Well, yes, I am really in favor of having installing criminal offenses here, and the penalties should be very severe.
Well, I think the STIKO should reassess the situation and find out what's going on, but it's quite clear, if as a doctor I prescribe a prohibited drug, and that is a special problem, and this has to be quite massively. If I don't inform people, probably even now I would have a problem in the situation that we have with the restricted approval license, and I think the doctor chambers will have to be informed.
In every single case, we're talking about severe bodily harm here, because first of all, we have a violation of the Medication Advertising Act, so they're advertising it, and the information that the manufacturers give themselves, i.e. we don't know whether it's efficacious, we also don't know whether it's harmful, but we want to be exempt from any liability, and that is what people need to know about, and that's why we would call a moratorium, stopping vaccinations immediately, and who violates that ban, at least vis-a-vis children and elderly people, will be held liable immediately.
That can be done by the doctor's law, because doctors are the only ones who are allowed to vaccinate, so informing them and showing them the consequences, they will stop vaccinating, because if a not indicated vaccination is done, that is simple bodily injury. That's quite a clear system here.
What about the STIKO, the Vaccination Commission? They're not liable either.
They only have a consultative function, and that is implemented by the government.
I have a question in this context. For instance, if there's a vaccination box that moves in front of a school and the teachers encourage the bus to come and to vaccinate children, do they fall under the Medication Advertising Act because they advertise without any knowledge of the facts?
In that new constellation, that may be helping and accessory result here, and this can't be the case that a child is simply can agree for something that the parents can't even understand the harm of. So we do the moratorium, and at the same time we inform the teachers and all school bodies who are in whatever way responsible for having children to be vaccinated are made responsible, and those who see it really say this, speak out loud. I think this is citizens' duty for everyone who sees vaccination buses that will be part of the moratorium.
Well, we don't want to fall back to a mode of denouncing each other. We don't want to repeat what the old government did, and tomorrow we will speak intensively about this advertising act, who is liable for violating it, and it is the institutions that obviously have allowed themselves to be subjected to large corporations, and it's also celebs who have said that vaccination is smart. It isn't smart, as we've just seen, and as we heard several times over here, that with every single vaccination we have the criminal offense of bodily harm. Only consent after information is consent. However, no individual patient has been properly informed, and therefore nobody could give their valid consent. And so we're talking of personal injury, sometimes with lethal consequences. That is a severe crime, not only for the companies but also individuals.
And then we still have the mesh of direct and indirect influence, which apparently leads to completely off-topic effects affecting topic decisions, and we need to have a different framework, legal framework for whistleblowing, because things that discover, unveil actions harmful to the population, and the regulation also has to take care that this is not abused in itself.
Well, this is a possibility that we could and actually should elaborate on, because it is often institutional corruption, not corruption of individuals, but that the entire institution is on the wrong track, and the Works Council there has an important role to play, and I think at least for the midterm we should consider how we can install such a protection for people with the help of the Works Councils, so that the Workers' Councils say we won't collaborate with that sort of thing anymore, so that people won't be punished for whistleblowing.
I also think this is important for officers, so that we have somebody to discuss this with, without fearing that, for example, if you think of a demonstration, that you're not left alone. That's important.
Well, civil servants have the same function as Works Councils.
But here we have to make sure that the people who have this function are objective and open.
That's another potential risk, yes.
I would like to come back to the fear of the people who have been vaccinated. We've talked a lot about the harm, and they will be informed of what they may be threatened with, and then they could get to interfere of the consequences is wondering who's going to help and what type of help can they expect. So here I think we have to be aware and look at what the people can cope with. Will that not enforce a self-fulfilling consequence? And we have followed the mainstream ideas, and now something bad may happen if we over-dramatize this. I think it may return like a boomerang and lead to another worst-case situation.
I think that's an important aspect, and that also means that we need to be careful that we don't contribute to a social rift, a societal rift, that we don't contribute to this splits running through our society. So we want to heal this gap, and I think that people who have been vaccinated and who haven't been vaccinated should support each other. And I think that the society has been split already, and to bring this back together, that, by making sure that people do things together. You can be wrong, you can make a mistake, some people are lucky, others are less lucky, and looking forward, it's important that we should that we help each other shouldn't be preempted by polarization.
Well, we're walking down both paths. We are trying to solidarize vaccinated and non-vaccinated people so that both parts can see the real enemy, who is the one who created the split up of society. And these are the people who, in lockstep with the industry that makes most money out of this, in the government, and created this and still right until our takeover have done so. That has to be overcome, and here it's of course important that psychology takes a special role, and that with the help of psychology, the people who have taken the vaccination and find out now that this may have been wrong, they get the support that they need. There's no other way to do this, but this can't be done by having psychologies active, as was reported to me, who have depressions and are in fear and need help, that we have psychologists who still wear a mask. This is something that has to be taken away. It's not in the head of the people wearing the coffee filter, and that they would have psychological help. That's not going to do repair in the heads of the people. So I think for a while these people must be excluded from trying to help because they can't.
Well, I think that if you received vaccination and you're worried, and that's why we should try to find all possibilities of combating the destruction that might be wrought in the body, that we do studies, post-mortem studies, to determine pathways, just to push medical knowledge so that we can find ways and means to help people, because that is of course particularly bad if you have to recognize, well, I might have made a mistake here for certain reasons, and now I have this problem, but there's no way out. The moment we can give people some hope that there might be treatments for any complications that may develop, ways that we can help people, that might be helpful already, and with many other things, the faster they recognize it, because they have a headache and they don't go around for 10 days before they're ready for a stroke already, or the thrombotic situation has already developed. If they go to the doctor immediately, and if they notice that if they see a doctor soon, they can help me. So we have to tell people face the brutal fact, that's the way it is, and we need to support them by offering ways out of the situation, but we have to make sure that we don't mothball people. We have to call on them to open their eyes. That's very important. We have to look at the psychological aspects of this, and I think that is something we should keep in our minds, that education is necessary.
Transparency and information is everything.
Well, I think that everything we are thinking now, our expectations, our assumptions, we have no data, but we fear only that this is coming. That doesn't mean that everybody who received a vaccination will have to bear these consequences, but those who do will have to be able to rely on doctors again.
That's a very important point, and that takes us back to the point you made, that what was the number of batches? 75%?
75% of side effects in 10% of batches.
That also means that a large part of the batches was completely harmless, because that could have been the control group. And in this sense, one could also see here that we could be hopeful, apart from the fact that 𝗵𝗺𝗺𝗃 is not the worst thing at all, that knowing this also gives us a certain point of clarity, not fully, but I always thought it was important that those who want to get vaccinated, I asked them to get their 𝗕𝘃𝗲𝗍𝗂 tested 7 days afterwards, because then you will know whether you have higher blood clotting problems or not, because if you don't, you can sit back and relax until nothing else happens, hopefully. So I think for today, as a Chancellor, I have to take a look at the other problems that we face, also the finances, economics, and so on. But I think for today, we know enough in order to immediately support the tutorial. We should come to an end to dedicate our meeting tomorrow to the Pharmaceutical Advertising Act, and that will play a role for the moratorium if we want to extend this to say those people who are responsible, and you will be liable immediately. And we'll also think about how to protect works councils and whistleblowers in a better way. And we'll have to make sure that as immediate effect, any suspicious cases would have to be done at post-mortem. And we also have to look at the hospitals that could specialize on adverse effects of the vaccinations. That's the result of what we have found out today, apart from the fact that there is no basis for any of the precaution. There's no basis for the vaccinations. They're not only just useless, but they are hazardous, and not only in the future, but also now, as we can already see in the figures which have not been disclosed yet. I think this is something that we can agree to as a general statement for the day. Okay, so we stay transparent for the audience, and we'll meet up again tomorrow.
Publikum, was weiterhin transparent von uns informiert werden wird. Bis morgen.